Good evening, everybody who's out there. If there's anybody out there, I've seen everybody been watching the football, but I'm not, which is quite painful for me. But tonight I'm going to talk about the role of the Somme campaign in the development of BEF logistics. What's important to note here is I'm not just going to talk about the Somme, as in the attack of the 1st of July 1916. I'm going to talk about the many Sommes, because the Somme is central to the development of BEF logistics and engineering throughout the war. This will become clearer, I hope, as we go along. First picture up there, never mind the quality field of width, is a quintessential image of the Somme. It's taken, I think, in early September. What we have there is a pack horse, and it's covered with what they call boots, gum, thigh, and they're going through the slime of the mud of the Somme. What we have here is this is actually an A-class road. This is not a track. This is an A-class road, and it tells us something about the nature of the battle and the nature of moving and supplying that battle and transporting through that battle. Anyway, let's move on and see what we can find out. I'm going to give the first word to our friend Dougie Haig. And here he is on the multifaceted role the Somme played in BEF development. I am urged thereto by the conviction that neither the course of the war itself nor the military lessons to be drawn therefrom can properly be comprehended unless the long succession of battles commenced on the Somme in 1916 and ended in November of last year, 1918, on the Sambre, are viewed as forming part of one great and continuous engagement. And that is the essential issue. One great and continuous engagement along the entirety of the Western Front, but also in terms of the Somme itself. One of the problems we've got with the Somme is we fix it in a particular date, at a particular time. We fix it at about 7 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of July, 1916. If you go to Newfoundland Park, the trenches are set at that particular time. However, there were something like 4 or 5 battles of the Somme, which extended all the way through to 1918. Now, the BEF's complex and dynamic relationship with the Somme is dominated by the 2 years 16 to 18. In 1916, we have the classic battles of the Somme. But in the spring of 1917, we have to deal with the Somme again, with the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line. And what's important there is it's BEF's first taste of open and mobile warfare after 2 years of being effectively stuck in the mud. In the spring of 1918, when the Germans attack, we have the first battles of the Somme, whereupon the Germans themselves attack and we have to withdraw. Then in the summer of 1918, from August the 8th onwards, we have the advance in Picardy and the second battles of the Somme. So there is a multiplicity of battles of the Somme, each of which teaches us lessons about how the BEF developed. Now, each of these interconnected but unique experiences have profound, complex, and oddly enough, quite contradictory effects on BEF logistical development, only fully comprehensible when we see it as a whole. The nature of the beast. These, to me, are the quintessential images of the First World War. We don't see here in these images the suffering of man. We don't see Tommy, cheerily smoking a fag in a trench or anything like that. What we see is industry, machines. We see internal combustion engines. Also, from the 19th century, we also see the horse as well. We see roads, we see production. So what is the nature of the beast of the First World War? Why is it truly a modern war? Because it's a mass industrial war. It uses the products and the processes and ideas of a mass industrial society. It's a war of systems, and a war of systems, each interconnected, each one affecting the other in a dynamic relationship. It's a war, really, of interdependency. What happens on the high seas? What happens when we are transporting materials from, say, Canada or Chile has a direct effect about what happens in that trench right at the front. It's also a war of management as well as command. Often we see Douglas Haig and the generals themselves being castigated for their lack of tactical and operational ability. We tend to forget also there's another dimension to this. This is one of the first wars where these generals have to manage a large organization and not just command a military force. And above all, underpinning everything, it's a war of logistics and engineering. Now, beyond the shock of the 1st of July, the overall butcher's bill and the apparent lack of success, what is the historical importance of the Somme? Well, there's two historical importances, and it reflects what you might call the separation between the two elements of the BEF. One is called ANQ, which is administration and quartermasters. It's the support, the maintenance, if you like, the housekeeping of the armies. And on the other hand, we have G. G's the fighting bit. It's command. It's about tactics, and it's about fighting, and it's about machine guns and the deployment of artillery. Now, one of the things we do know about the Somme is it's seen, though this is, I will caveat everything on this, it's seen as the beginning of the learning curve of the BEF. I'm not sure whether it actually is or not, but that's how it is seen. Yeah, the Somme was a watershed in the development of the BEF way in war. Excuse me, hang on, there's a cup of tea just suddenly appeared from nowhere. Thank you very much. For example, the operational level of war, an advanced appreciation of the sheer scale of the Western Front warfare and the need for what was a small colonial police force, in effect, which is what the original BEF was, to address that scale through the developments of corps as the key operational formation, the use of machine guns, the brigading of machine guns, and then their use at the divisional level, and finally also at the corps level, the movement of artillery from being a divisional asset to being a corps and then army asset. C3, or command, control and communication, the redistribution of these functions upwards and downwards according to operational and tactical circumstance. We see also the development of all arms cooperation. Instead of effectively various units, the artillery, the infantry, the engineers, working side by side, we now see them cooperating as a singular whole. And one of the best expressions of that is the developments of the all-arms firepower platoon. We see that cooperation between arms, the Royal Flying Corps, artillery, infantry, and we see it reach its peak, if you like, during the magnum opus of Messine's 1917, where each element functions with the other elements to create something which is bigger than the some of the parts, a whole that's bigger than some of the parts. So we also see the development and integration of different artillery roles. Artillery is, as Stalin said, the god of war. We see the development of destructive fire, suppressive fire, infantry support fire, and counter battery fire. And we also see the introduction of new weapons, new technologies, one of which, for example, is the tank. So we have a learning curve, so they say, a revisionist or operationalist objectivity that's enriched our understandings. We've come a long way from the Somme being a bloody slaughter and lions led by donkeys. However, even today, research and debate is still framed by a focus on challenging Blackadder, which seems to have been going round and round and round forever. But more importantly, a focus on the teeth arms, on the experience of the infantry, on artillery firepower, on tactical development, on battles, and also on command and leadership. We tend to be fairly obsessed by generals of different types and orders. So the contribution of the role of the Somme to the learning curve is understood in terms of a linear progression. We're supposed to have gotten better, in a kind of upwards curve. Actually, it's nothing to do with an upwards curve. You can't even describe it as a set of steps. It's a kind of jagged progression, which we revert backwards and forwards. We unlearn lessons, we learn lessons, we forget those lessons, and then we apply them again. But one might argue there's a general trend where the British Army, the BEF, gets better and better and better at its job. The Somme lessons, begin with the Somme, are progressively developed and applied throughout the course of 1917, and arguably the peak is reached in the summer of 1918 with the alleged achievement of the all-arms battle. Now then, moving on. How do we change this light bulb? What's this Somme learning curve? So I missed it there. Sorry, I've gone backwards there by saying. Right. Logistics, though, and its concomitant engineering is the one crucial area it's been generally ignored. And logistics is central to the nature of warfare during 1917. It's central to the Second Industrial Revolution. It's about transportation and interconnectedness. Logistics is central to that nature of warfare in 17. It's central to victory in 1918. It defines the particulars and the natures of that victory. This logistical development is not linear. It's multiple. It's, I like this word, asynchronous. It's closely related, and you also have antagonistic learning curves. During 1917, for example, you have two sets of learning curves, both of which are actually antagonistic with each other. I'll come to those in a moment, yeah? And the Somme is central to this development of BEF logistics. And when I say the Somme, I don't mean the July the 1st Somme, I mean the Somme from 16 all the way through to 18. It's an intimate relationship which is conducted over time and space, and it's not confined and not necessarily a direct result of the 1916 campaign. Now then, a little problem here. There's I can't actually see the top of my titles here because I've got this thing from Zoom in front of it. Now, Somme is critical to the logistic development in two ways, and it creates two distinct learning curves. We have the Somme-inspired collapse of the military-run, what was described as an ad hoc BEF logistics system in late 1916, and the consequent centralization and expansion of logistics by civilian experts, of which the primary one is the Director General of Transportation, Sir Eric Geddes, the only man to hold the position of Admiral and General at the same time. But even as that addressed the static nature of the war, and indeed Sir Eric Geddes works within the framework of this is a static war where we have to grind down the enemy in attritional warfare, the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line in the early spring of 1917, itself a direct consequence of German losses in the summer and autumn of 1916, the experience of which suggested the creation of a far more decentralized system under military control, which is very similar to what you might call pre-war field service regulations, which specified Johnny on the spot. So we have at the one point a kind of centralization and expansion, but on the other hand, when we enter into this new phase, brief as it was, of mobile warfare and open warfare, we find that decentralization is what's needed. So the former addresses supply under the prevailing static conditions of trench lock, but the latter addresses supply under future mobile conditions. Now, although apparently contradictory, both these learning curves, of which not a great deal is known, were applied and developed throughout 1917, and they make all the difference in 1918. Moving on, what is logistics? Banged on about it. Let's see what it is. Ways to provide all means, human and material, for the conduct of war. Well, that's a narrow, sharp definition. The production, supply and distribution and maintenance of armies in the field. The provision of all material required to wage war. Well, these are not narrow definitions. These are extraordinarily wide definitions, but they are what defines logistics. How do we work it? A brief canter through the BEF supply chain. In 1914, it was actually an extremely advanced supply chain. Now, one of the issues about the BEF supply chain, one of the reasons it was so advanced, is even in 1914, small and tiny as the BEF was, the BEF supply chain specifically included the use of motor transport between railhead and refilling point. I'll come to why that's important in a while. Effectively, supplies arrive at the base port, whether that be troops, material, shells, whatever. Supplies are unloaded and then moved to what's known as a transit depot by rail. You need to get it off the side of the quays as quickly as possible, because if you don't, you end up with gigantic piles of equipment. You end up with a situation that we had in late 1914, early 1915, where a machine gun is in one box under a great big pile in one particular port, and then you find that its tripod and its spare parts kit is in another port under another great big pile. At the transit depot, supplies will be loaded in bulk for rail movement to other depots, and most of which is the advanced base. Now, the advanced base is located on the railway for the supply of what's known as field units. By rail, it then goes to the most important element of the railway, which is the regulating station. Everything up until that point arrives in bulk. It's at the regulating station that that bulk is broken down into ammunition trains, into what's known as pack trains, which contains everything a particular division needs for one day or 1 week or whatever, and are the specialist engineering trains. So this is where it's broken down into detail. It then goes by rail to the railhead. The railhead is an important point for reasons that I'll come to very shortly. And it's that supplies are unloaded, usually onto motor transport. You will have to excuse me. And they're moved on by motor transport to the refilling point, which is usually around about 5 to 6 miles, or even closer from the front line itself. There, the supplies are dumped and they're transferred to a field unit, usually horse transport, and then they're taken to the field units and the supplies are delivered, and then usually the Port Bloody Infantry and Shank's Pony take over to take it to the front line. So the key points are base port, regulating station, railhead, and then refilling point and field units. Now, the crucial juncture, the railhead, differentiate between two worlds. You have the rear, behind the railhead, up as far as the base port, is where you have the rear, as it's known as. It's not normally subject to enemy action, though by 1916, 1917, we find that German bombers are beginning to become quite active there, and also in some areas, specifically around Ypres, German long-range high-velocity guns can reach into the rear, but it's not normally subject to action. It's a stable area which you can plan for. Beyond the railhead is the front, or if you like, the fighting zone, where fighting is the norm. It's a fluid area that's subject to continual action. And over time, it's also an area that is getting bigger and bigger and bigger due to the increase in artillery and the increase in range of artillery. Now, in this forward area, horse transport, normal means of distribution in the forward area, has a radius of 7 miles, which is not a great deal. But the British Expeditionary Force, by inserting motor transport after the railhead, increases this radius of action by an extra 30 miles. So in reality, the BEF has a maximum a radius of action of some 30 to 40 miles. This increases the mobility and independence and increases the flexibility of rail itself. The expansion of the BEF simply defies description. I am continually astonished by this, even though I've been looking at this particular subject for far too long, for many decades now, I've got to say. In 1914, the Army Service Corps numbered 14,491. By 1918, that had increased to 326,590. In 14, there were 24,035 Royal Engineers. In 1918, there were 357,000 Royal Engineers. In 1914, there was 1 mile broad gauge or standard gauge railway construction. In 1918, that railway construction had increased to 1,298 miles. British Rail, or whatever you call yourself these days, please take note of that. Now, excuse me. if we look at something as banal as horse standings, I'm sure you've all heard of horse standings. It's where you park your horses. I'm not really a kind of an equine person myself, but that's where you park your horses. And in 1917, the 4th Canadian Division, it gives a list of the materials required for their 4,500 horses. 12,000 tons of hardcore stone, 1.5 tons of nails, 3.5 miles wooden fascines, 18,000 sheets of iron, 3,960 wooden poles, and 60 standard trains to cart it all over. That's quite astonishing. That's just for one division out of something like 60 on the Western Front. So let's have a look at the first Somme, which I've called fixed and immutable. The classic image here of the poor, long-suffering mule trying to get through what we would call today impossible mud. It's beyond Glastonbury standard, this one. For those of you who have attended Glastonbury, you'll know exactly what I mean. For those of you who haven't, it's muddy. Now then, let's have a look at the railways. The railways are, for all sides, for all the belligerents involved in this war, the backbone of supply. It's how you bulk supply. The BEF had made no provision for operating or constructing railways in France pre-war. Why? Because they didn't expect to have a long war. They certainly didn't expect to have an army, a BEF consisting of 5 armies and 60 divisions on the Western Front. And the pre-war Anglo-French agreement stipulated that France would provide all railway needs for the BEF upon request. The only thing that Britain had to do was provide bilingual railway transport officers to superintend training and detraining. Why? We had a small army, we had a short war, we expected it to be quite fast moving as well. And that's why we had this inclusion of motor transport in our modernized supply chain. And we were wrong. But all sides didn't, had failed to understand what would happen next. Now, between up to 1915, we have business as usual. But there's an elephant in this particular room of business as usual. The British Expeditionary Force made no significant changes to a logistical system which was built around an initial force of around about 90 to 100,000 men. One of the things that, reasons for this is a shortage of material initially acted as a brake on expansion. Now, this obscures the military's lack of knowledge, vision, and technical skills and leads to a fragmented view. Effectively, the military do not understand modern logistics, the idea of movement of masses of material, masses of meten, where we run into a lot of zeros, as it were. Now, this brake on expansion, there we see the shortage of material, the shortage of men, everything that we see in 1915, also allows the BEF to muddle through using an ad hoc policy. In other words, what they did was they made minor changes that were made on the hoof in response to specific situations. There was no wholesale change. There had been various reports made which has suggested significant change, but generally speaking, the military kind of wished those away. There was also, as I've noted before, cultural separation of administration, or A&Q, from command. Effectively, commanders did not concern themselves with administrative matters, as they called it, and administrators and supply issues. They had no interest really in the fighting bit. There was also a compartmentalization of logistical functions. Motor transport kept to itself, railways kept to itself, supplies kept to itself, ordnance kept to itself. There was no integration there. So there's no coherence, no coordination, or even overall view. That's the elephant in the room, because as things get bigger and bigger and bigger, this becomes unsustainable. So this elephant was plain to see, but it remains invisible, as the elephant in the room tends to be, until we reach the Battle of the Somme. Now, let's move over to the French connection, because France has a profound effect upon the development of the BEF, not just tactically or operationally in 1916, but also logistically in terms of effects upon the ground. Because by 1916, the French are increasingly unable to meet their rail transport obligations that were agreed to before 1914. They had taken an enormous number of casualties, and that meant they were stripping the railways of skilled and semi-skilled men, who were necessary for the maintenance and upkeep. At the same time as the rail system had to expand to accommodate ever bigger armies and ever more men, ever more materials, ever more shells and guns, and the pressure on that railway system was increasing. This leads to a lack of maintenance. It leads to a lack of maintenance when it comes to track. It leads to a lack of maintenance when it comes to locomotives. And it also leads to a lack of maintenance when it comes to the humble wagon that train pulls. One of the biggest difficulties that the BEF and France faced throughout 1916 and 1917 wasn't necessarily a shortage of locomotives, of which there was, or track, which there was, but of wagons, because wagons are necessary for you to put your stuff in. If you've got no wagons, you cannot move your stuff. It's as simple as that. There is a succession of ad hoc, unrelated, formal and informal requests from the French for additional British aid and support, but nothing coherent. There's no big plan here. It concerns itself, can you take over a little bit of track construction and maintenance? Can you start dealing with construction of stations, railheads, water systems, for the locomotives, etc., etc.? Can we have a little bit of operational support? Can we have some equipment? Could you start importing some of your locomotives and rolling stock? The key thing to understand here is that there is no coherent system. There's no big plan. Again, this will be revealed by two critical battles of 1916. The first of which is Verdun. Now, we know that the relationship between Verdun and the Somme and the genuine role of the BEF is well known. We tend to see it in terms of the BEF having to take more of the line, and that the BEF contribution to the proposed offensive is dramatically increased from effectively we will work alongside France, which will provide the major part of the battle, to the BEF taking over the major part of the battle itself, as Verdun sucks in more and more and more and more French troops, equipment, material. Less is well known about the impact on BEF logistics, because those French losses at Verdun accelerate. They draw in more and more vital railway workers into a time when the French railway system is already under far too much strain. So this problem of the collapsing, French railways, which is in slow motion, now accelerates, and it compounds that problem in a very short space of time. Certainly between March and August 1916, there is a dramatic decline in the French railways, of which the BEF are dependent on. And as I've said before, one of the biggest problems is the shortage of railway wagons and locomotives. For the BEF also, we see what railway capacity there is being increasingly diverted to the needs of the French at Verdun. Now, in July of 1916, reality begins to close its jaws on the BEF, and we see the beginnings of a collapse. Now, in spring of 1916, the BEF reaches its peak size. There has been a rapid increase in supplies of all natures, especially artillery, not just in terms of numbers, but also in terms of types of guns, which in turn creates complex part systems required for different types of artillery. We see a huge increase in the number of shells, though not necessarily an increase in the quality of those shells, because we're drawing them in from the United States as well as in Britain. For example, to give you some idea, between June and July, the weekly ammunition train deliveries to the Somme leapt from 5 trains to 90 trains each week. So as this trickle becomes a torrent, the inadequacies of the BEF logistical system are exposed, and the system begins to collapse surprisingly rapidly. Within just a few days of the attack taking place, about the 6th or the 7th of July, it's safe, there were 18 miles of loaded trains stuck at Amiens railhead. So this problem of congestion begins to spread both backwards to the ports and the regulating stations. Everything is connected, so therefore the ripple effect is magnified as we go forward, and also forward into the combat area. We see increasingly shortages of shells, shortages of this, shortages of that. However, the nature of logistics itself, the nature of engineering is you tend not to notice these. They're not dramatic. It's not like losing a battle or the failure of a battalion or a brigade to take a position. It tends to eat away slowly. If you have gathered, I've done up a house, I'm sure you saw that you all got houses, you'll notice that the rot and the collapse of the door or the stains that I've got up on my ceiling because the roof is beginning to leak happens slowly, until suddenly it collapses. So that's one of the elements where this reality bites. And it's also one of the reasons that even though that reality is biting, still we do not see the British Expeditionary Force begin to realize what the issue is. We can see this in terms of the number of ammunition trains that were delivered, which were running at something like 95% of those ammunition trains demanded for the Somme, as opposed to roadstone, upon which all movement will depend, which about 55 to 60% is actually supplied. Excuse me while I just take a glass of wine. I keep talking about big and size. So how big is big? Well, Somme, give you some idea. The Quartermaster General's War Diary states that on the 11th of June 1916, there were 1,408,214 troops on the Western Front, 378,352 horses, and 15,291 3-ton lorries. The ammunition that was delivered during the 1 week of the 19th of June to the 26th of June 1916 was 21,981 tons. Shells fired by the Fourth Army from the 1st to the 2nd of July 1916 were 224,221. During the Battle of Flers, from the 15th to the 16th of the 1916, they fired 302,326. And for the Fourth Army, the total number of rounds fired, or from the beginning of the bombardment, the week before the 1st of July, up to the 22nd of November 1916, was 15,560,795. And that's just for Fourth Army. It doesn't include Fifth Army or any flanking fire from the French or from Third Army itself. So that is scale. Looking further down at one of the forgotten units of the Western Front, because we're our focus on battle, is the siege park. For those who know what a siege park is, I'm going to explain what they are. There's a core siege park. Now, I'm looking here at 5 core siege park, which is also known as E siege park, it being the 5th letter of the alphabet. A siege park, effectively, is the collection of all the guns, siege calibers, that's 6-inch, 8-inch, 9.2-inch, also some of the specialized high velocity 4.7-inch guns, so on and so forth, which are collected at core level. It's also all of the support that's required for it, the workshops that are required for it, the men, the lorries, the stores, the tractors, steam tractors. And on the 29th of June 1916, this one core siege park consisted of nearly 2,000 men, 541 lorries to move all the equipment and ammunition required for these siege lorries, 11 workshops which look after the 541 lorries as well as all the other mechanical equipment there and also the guns, 24 stores, and stores are a big organization which are required therefore to replenish the needs of the siege park. They have 77 four-wheel drive tractors to pull 6-inch howitzers and on occasion 8-inch howitzers. They have 60 Holtz tractors, of which I'll show you some photographs in a minute, to pull the 8-inch howitzers and the 9.2-inch howitzers. They also have 7 Foster Daimler siege tractors, steam tractors rather, to pull the really heavy caliber machines. And they also have 15-inch howitzers, though those are moved by rail. Though in 1918, when we reach the back end of 18, when we look at September, October, we find that those are being converted to road-going things. They have 38 cars and 176 motorcycles, which are quite often being nicked by everybody because motorcycles were very much sought after on the Western Front. Here we have some examples of what's involved in a siege part. We have here on the top left there, just there, if you can see my pointer there, that is a Daimler Foster steam tractor. It's pulling stores wagons here, which if the photograph was longer, we'd see would actually stretch quite a long way back. On the right top, this complicated and rather Heath Robinson looking piece of machinery is a Holtz Caterpillar tractor. You know, today we have the Caterpillar tractor, or the CAT as it's known, which is an integral part of, especially the United States military. This is the great granddaddy of them all. And this is the standard piece of equipment used to tow a single gun or its equivalent. And we can see on the bottom left here, we've got some 8-inch howitzers, which are being pulled by these tractors. Now, they can only do 3 miles per hour. And if you move them more than about 5 miles on a hard surface, they start shaking themselves to bits, which is one of the reasons why they need the workshop wagons. On the bottom right picture here, we have a picture which is taken in late July of 1916, where we see the destruction of the trenches there. This is in the back area of the forward zone for the British. They're moving forward, but we can see there that presents some of the difficulties of moving these things forward. In good weather, with good tracks, good roads, you know, you can move an 8-inch howitzer in position from point to point in about 6 hours, though it may take something like 24 to 30 hours to actually get it ready to fire, bring up all the ammunition, so on and so forth. In bad weather, it can take 8 hours to move 100 yards. So what we're looking at here is is a dichotomy. Because we're relying more and more on heavier calibers of guns to do the destructive work against the enemy and to fire those further distances where the field artillery can't reach. That in turn requires these machines, but these machines effectively increase what's Clausewitz called friction. And so therefore what we have is an increasingly static force, when in fact the BEF was first designed to be a very mobile force. But the more we rely on this, and remember there's an entire ammunition supply, which is the much greater part of that, following up behind 500 and odd lorries, 570 odd lorries. So this increases friction and creates an increasingly static BEF. One of the great ironies of the Battle of the Somme is that had the BEF managed to break through, highly unlikely, but if it had, it still couldn't have done anything about it really, because it was not in a position to be a mobile force, and it had forgotten many of the lessons. The structure of the BEF itself, its supply system, had become increasingly static. So moving on. Now, human beings get things wrong. We misunderstand things. It's easy in hindsight to criticize them, yeah, but at the time, things are not the same. And then a misguided attempt to relieve the railways, because the railways, once we move the Somme and we begin to fight there, can start collapsing very, very quickly indeed. The BEF dramatically increases its use of motor lorries. Now that would seem to be a reasonable idea, but we have a problem, especially on the Somme. The best road you've got can be described as indifferent chalk roads. It's an agricultural area, so it has very little in the way of road transportation infrastructure because it doesn't need it. it's an agricultural area. It's a couple of wagons, from the French local farmers, Tante Charlotte's, with one horse gig. They simply do not need it. So, traditionally what would happen is that winter would come around, the roads would get, increasingly muddy. They would scrape away that top layer. They would wait for spring, which would then we see the roads beginning to recover, and they would go forward again. You start putting 572 lorries on just one siege park, and in total there was something like about 12,000 lorries functioning on the Somme in the area, plus all those heavy Foden steam tractors, plus 9.2-inch howitzers and 8-inch howitzers. You will find that everything collapses very, very quickly. So these indifferent chalk roads simply start collapsing under the weight. And as soon as autumn arrives, September, October, the whole thing suddenly gets an awful lot worse. There is therefore a serious increase in demand for roadstone for repairs in order to get things going, also beach planks. How do we get this roadstone, these beach planks, or these wooden sleepers to build temporary roads to the front line? Answer, you need railways. So this leads to the increasing use of railways to supply the stone, which in turn increases the strain on the railways, which means that lorry breakdown rates increase because the roads are not being maintained, they're not being built. Rail breakdown rates increase because they're having to cart ever more stuff forward, and so both roads and rail get worse. Photograph here at the bottom right here is what happens when this ripple effect occurs, when that rail breaks down, when those roads break down. This is at a port. Now, there we have a picture there of supplies, various types. There are barrels there are boxes there are large cases there. You try and find what you need there. It's one of the reasons they need to clear it quickly, but it becomes ever more difficult to do as this ripple effect moves backwards. The irony of this is actually the Americans in 1918 who ignored the experience of the French and the BEF in 1914 to 1917 and paid the price for that. Now then, the whole of this leads to shortages of materials so acute that operations are either cancelled or scaled down. We've gone beyond the point of not being able to move forward into simply not being able to function at all. First Australian Division abandons a large-scale attack at Pommier in early November due to lack of materials. Smaller-scale attacks result in failure at very high cost. Motor ambulances unable to use the road, leading to the breakdown of the Casevac system. The horse ration has to be reduced because we can't get enough oats. We can't get enough straw in there. There are no blankets. There are no horse standings or huttings because all of these need to be brought through on rail and road. And indeed, we find that in the forward area of supply, only pack horses and mules can get forward. In effect, we're now going back to an ancient mode of warfare using the humble mule and the pack horse to cart things forward. How to deal with this collapse? Well, bring in the civilian experts. I mean, the British Army's always worked with civilian experts, but this becomes more and more imperative when we see the British Army, moving towards these second industrial revolution, towards these mass industrial type of warfare. The military are hostile towards civilian logistics experts, not because of the military necessarily. They've got a fair point. Question is, what do the civilians know about military railways, military needs? Yes, you can cart fish from Billingsgate on the railway. Yes, you can move, various stores, etc., from train station to train station. But this is the military. It's a completely different dynamic, a different world. It's a bit like trying to take a civilian round peg and stick it in a military square hole. But there were some crossovers. We have, for example, the experience of the director of railways, Sir Percy Girouard, in the South African War. However, it's interesting to note that in the South African War, Girouard reformed the railway system there, and this was undone by Sir John French in the interim. Now, in 1914, Sir Percy Girouard was sent over to look at the transport and rail system in France. This was done by Kitchener, who were quite far-sighted in this respect. Now, Girouard inspected the system. He recommended centralisation under civilian control, but the report findings were effectively roundly rejected. There was an attempt, there was a takeover of the civilians at the docks and the ports, so to increase efficiency there. But by 1915, the Royal Engineers, whose nose was somewhat out of joint by this, had kind of pushed back against this. There is particularly hostile criticism from Sir Jack Cowans, who's the War Office Quartermaster General, Sir R.C. Maxwell, who was the BEF Inspector General of Communications and later the Quartermaster General, and also the Inspector General of Communications after Maxwell, General FS Rob. All of these and others are pushing back. But by late 1916, it's become clear the BEF had changed out of all recognition. It was now a giant company. It was a huge corporation, and it had to change, and you needed civilian now aid. And cometh the hour, cometh the man. So Eric Campbell Geddes, who was the general manager of the Northeastern Railway. He was part of Lloyd George's Ministry of Munitions team, and he really exemplifies this reality of what is a civilian war. Now, in the autumn of 1916, he inspected the entire BEF transportation system from port to railhead. Now, when he was sent over, Haig was initially very dubious. He took the army line. What do civilians know of movement and transportation in war? But to his eternal credit, he backed, once he actually spoke to Geddes, he began to back him and understand what he was trying to achieve. And therefore, he had Haig's support against an awful lot of, especially Royal Engineers, who were very much against it. Indeed, R.C. Maxwell, the Quartermaster General, threatened to resign at one point over Geddes's inspection, as it were. Now, Geddes effectively declared the entire transport system not fit for purpose, and he proposed sweeping changes. This puts these Royal Engineer noses way out of joint, and also some in the Army Service Corps, though not many. But Haig backs Geddes. He realizes he needs the right men to run the system. So therefore, he backs Geddes, and Geddes is put in charge of the BEF transportation under the great transportation system at Montreuil, and it was known as Gettysburg, oddly enough. And he took over literally everything from port to that railhead. That was the domain now of the Director General of Transportation. Huge responsibility. So everything was changed. Ports, docks, storage, distribution, railway construction and operation, rolling stock and railheads, road construction and operation, inland waterways transport, and the introduction of a vast light railway system in order to try and reduce the use of motor transport, which is something we were beginning to learn from the French and from the Germans. He also proposed the removal of all these functions from Quartermaster General and the formation of this centralised transportation, the GHQ, under a DGT, or Director General of Transportation. He also introduced modern systems like statistical prediction, scientific management, and specialised civilian expertise. And what he did was he created a truly integrated transport system, very similar to the civilian one. But he was also fully aware that it would only work in a static situation, effectively as a civilian system might work in the United Kingdom, where things are static. We don't see towns being destroyed or sudden deviations or, railway lines being taken over or anything like that. So it's a fixed and static system, and that's why he's the man for the job. But it's also, if you like, the fly in the ointment or the flaw which will reveal itself later on. So, Geddes reforms were revolutionary and startling. Spring 17, Geddes had created a mass civilian system, which can now satisfy this bulk insatiable appetite of the BEF's war machine. So this created the conditions that allowed the commanders to conceive and organise These colossal artillery-dominated set-piece operations we see in 1917. You know, for example, at Messines, 144,000 tons of shells stockpiled for this operation, third EPA, in excess of 4 million shells per week expended on average. But the law of unintended consequences begins to kick in, because the use of overwhelming artillery, and in 1917, the use of artillery way outstrips that from 1916, creates an increasing miles deep, impassable, devastated zone. And there is no means to cross this. Remember, the writ of the DGT ends at the railhead. After that, you depend upon horse and motor transport, and also increasingly light railway. But light railway isn't actually that much use further forward. It's subject to too much shell fire. It often doesn't go where you need it. It's unreliable. So once again, we see operations flounder. Initial success, the artillery pounds the enemy and protects the infantry going forward. But as each operation successively unfolds, they begin to flounder. Operational tempo is lost and the whole thing grinds to a halt. The irony is that Geddes reforms needed static warfare to work well. And by working well, they perpetuated the static war, and so on and so forth. An example of artillery firepower, these are actually not from the Somme, they're from Tyne Cot in the EPA front. This photograph was taken on the 16th of June 1917, and we can see here the railway there, that's the road up to Passchendaele on there, and the blue arrow denotes the road corner there and Tyne Cot itself. You can see that it's a bit battered, it's got trenches in it, but it's pretty much a collection of fields. It's recognizable as such. This was the situation on the 2nd of October 1917, dramatic change. There's the core of the railway again. There's the road up to Passchendaele, devoid now of all trees, and there's Tyne Cot itself. Now we're looking at something more of a moonscape, and the only reason they're outlining the fields at all is because they've got trenches running around the edges. This is the situation on the 10th of October 1917. The photograph here is moved around 90 degrees. The blue arrow though tells you there's the core of the railway, there's the curve of the road, there's Tyne Cot, and it is absolutely obliterated. That's what can be done in a mere 8 days with the power of the artillery that we have. Somewhere in there is my grandfather, who was with the 2nd 7th Battalion, the Manchester Regiment, who attacked on the 9th of October 1917 into horrendous conditions here. And this photograph was taken from about 500 feet on the morning of the 10th of October, which ironically, despite the previous deluge, had actually opened up a beautiful, clear, bright day. We move now to the Somme 2, the second bit of the Somme, which is a bit of a quiet revolution, which runs entirely counter to everything I've been talking about with Sir Eric Geddes and static warfare. Moving on, by March 1917, the German retreat to the Hindenburg Line took place on the Somme. I'm not going to go into the reasons why it took place, or whether it was superbly done, or whether it was a vindication of the Battle of the Somme itself. That's not what I'm looking at here, because when it's analysed afterwards, it's really seen as of no real consequence, except for one thing, that it partly spoiled plans for an Allied spring offensive. By withdrawing away, you put a gap between the Fifth Army and the French armies, and it tends to screw up the plans that have been worked out for the Nivelle offensives of 1917. Yet arguably, and this is becoming increasingly so, is that the German retreat is really one of the most important events of the war, and it's the reason why the British and the French themselves as well did so well in 1918. Why is that? Well, because once you move beyond looking at it in terms of strategy and operations and the way it spoilt things for spring 1917, it's the BEF's first experience of mobile warfare in 1914, and it's its first ever under modern conditions. Remember the War of 1914, the early part of that war, is a million miles away from 1917. They also found out that the pursuit of the German army, which was withdrawing, was a matter of logistics and engineering. It's not of G side of things. It's not about tactics. It's not about battles. It's about roads and rail and moving across an area that the enemy is devastated and trying to maintain contact with them in a mobile situation. So logistics and engineering are what allow the pursuit to be maintained. Now, the logistical engineering lessons learnt in this quiet part of the war that's pretty much forgotten about stimulated a big, but itself quiet change in the BEF system of warfare, especially when we look at logistics and engineering. So when the BEF attacked in 1918, we have to ask the question, how did we do so? How did they manage to move quickly and maintain that tempo of movement? The answer is the lessons drawn from the retreat in 1917. Now, BEF were open warfare virgins, their first experience in mobile warfare since 14. The difficulties they encountered were absolutely myriad: transport, supply, roads, engineering. They had to deal with mines and booby traps. Bridges were a major problem as well. The Germans blow them up, and trying to get across a bridge is trying to get across a river or a canal is trying to get across the biggest trench you've ever seen. Because you no longer have this constant stream of material coming up, it's being interrupted. Yeah, you've got to think in terms of salvage. Command and control changes as well, and we begin to see also the use of more and more machine guns, because you moving those heavy artillery, those siege pieces up, is really quite difficult. Now, not all the lessons were fully understood or digested, and not all arms understood or digested those lessons at the same rate, but those lessons will bear fruit in 1918 when the BEF reviews its experience. And here we have an example. This is a light railway here. But what we got here is we don't see a light railway locomotive, which weighs in about sort of 10 to 12 tons, and nor do we see something as simplex 40 or 20 horsepower tractor. What we see is a Ford Model T. It's built in Crewe, and it's been converted into running on railways. That is a quick, cheap, light means, and quite powerful means, of being able to move there. It's shifting quite a lot of the heavy shells there, as you can see there. That's one of the experiences they had. They needed something that was quick, which could be built, and it's a Ford Model T. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of these were built, so they could be converted very quickly, very easily. What were the lessons learned? Well, in 1918, as things settled down, as after the German assault, then Kaiserslautern, Special Operation Michael, itself a mobile battle, logistics were given a much higher profile and priority. Roadstone becomes the equal of ammunition. We also see the beginning of decentralization of command. In static warfare, you need to centralize your command, control, communication. In open warfare, where you have much more going on, it's a much more dynamic situation, you have to decentralize that command. This was again first learned during the German retreat, and it was slowly perfected over the course of 1917, ready for 1918. Corps, still the nexus point. It's still the most important formation in terms of driving operations, but BEF learned that you need to be able to rapidly switch the locus of command between divisions and corps according to circumstance, and they did that. It was an administrative brilliance there. Also, they learned about pooling. Instead of each unit having its equipment, they began to pool vital equipment, transport, lorries, to be used as needed rather than attached to a definite unit or formation. Bridging suddenly takes on an enormous role there. It's very important. And also the realization that light railways simply are not going to work in a mobile battle. You can't lay them quickly enough. You can't run them. You need motor transport, the humble 3-ton lorry. So this is centralized pools, and it's given a definite structure again over the course of 1917, ready for 1918. The pre-war broad gauge railway and motor transport policy was abandoned by Geddes, but it was reconstituted. Under Geddes, it was, broad gauge railway and light 60-centimetre railways. So arguably what we see here is this return to a central Johnny-on-the-spot principle, which was enshrined, ironically enough, in pre-war field service regulations. What are the lessons we learned? Forward road construction. After the Battle of Loos, and indeed just before the Battle of the Somme, the Deputy Director of Supplies and Transport of the Seven Corps gave a talk about the Battle of the Loos. And here he stressed the absolute vital importance of roads and road maintenance and keeping them open. It's a lesson that the BEF took a long time to learn, because the same lesson pops up at the Battle of the Somme. It pops up again in 1917. But commanders tend to focus on guns and shells rather than the means of moving those guns and shells. So it's vital forward road construction, especially for motor transport and medium and heavy guns. Without roads, there is no advance. So by 1918, road stone supply and road construction is given priority, and indeed they start beginning to build specialized road stone railheads to make that supply easier. Rapid water supply techniques are being developed, pumping and borehole technology, development of horse and motor transport water carriers, so on and so forth. It is ironic that it's the much maligned Gough and his reviled MGGS, Neil Malcolm, who were the cheerleaders of this way as early as March 1917. They recognized the problems that were going to be faced when we actually did return to mobile warfare. Bridging is vital to movement. Rivers are an effective block. In 1916, 1918, and Second World War, so on and so forth, rivers are a big block. Now, the lessons of the German retreat were central to the development of BEF bridging techniques. In March 1917, they began installing a bridging officer at GHQ, reflecting its importance. Standardized English and Hopkins bridges were designed using interchangeable, effectively flat pack parts, the kind of early IKEA bridges. This requires less skilled labor. It means they can be built much more quickly. Sections of bridge are designed to be carried by motor transport. The formation of army bridging store depots and newly motorized army bridging sections, and also bridging materials are centrally pooled for use as required. And a successive system of bridging is developed whereby light bridges are thrown over, then medium bridges, these are taken up, heavy bridges are thrown over, these are taken up, and a proper stone bridge is built. In late 1917, a new edition of the Organization of Bridging Work is published. Rapid bridging train is introduced, and command of bridging is devolved down to lower levels. So instead of it being an army affair, armies are getting left behind in 1918 as they were during the German retreat in 1917. Now we can move forward, and it makes a big difference. In April 1917, at the Somme crossings, it took 11 days to build one heavy bridge. In September 1918, it takes them 3 days to build 5 heavy bridges. This makes a huge difference and allows the BEF to maintain its force and its tempo, pushing the German back. In bridging command in 1916, the army controls the bridges. In 1917, April, after the experience of the German withdrawal, bridging is transferred to Corps because army is now too far behind. At the 100 days 1918, Corps becomes in charge of heavy bridging, and its division, which is now in control of bridging up to 5.5 tons. The key link in any mobile warfare, World War I, is motor transport. It's the vital link. There is pressure throughout 1917 to permanently slash the number of lorries. Part of this is because of Geddes in the introduction of light railways. There's also enormous pressure from the Quartermaster General, Jack Cowans, at the War Office as well. Now that we have light railways, why are you still using lorries? Lorries use up an enormous amount of petrol. They do about 3.5 to the gallon. Yeah. Haig, again, to his credit, he resists, arguing their retention as a precaution against possible railway breakdowns. And in this case, he was an oracle because there were significant railway breakdowns in 1918. At a motor transport conference at GHQ in August, it is he proposes the withdrawal of lorries into a GHQ reserve. So effectively, he says we will remove lorries off the road, but we won't actually send them back to UK. Genius of a move. Motor transport, meanwhile, is being reorganized. Divisional supply columns and ammunition subparks are amalgamated in divisional mechanical transport companies. Again, centralized. The same process happens at corps level. We have corps supply columns, corps troop supply columns, which are now redesignated corps troops motor transport companies. Army supply columns, which are already motorized, are given an auxiliary motor transport company, become Army Troops Motor Transport Companies. A lot of acronyms here, but effectively they're taking maybe 7 separate organizations and they're reducing them to 4. They also create a universal establishment. It's very similar to the development of the platoon, strangely enough, where a section consists of 16 lorries, 15 functioning lorries, 1 spare, and columns and companies consist of a standardized number of sections, HQ and a variable number of motor transport sections. Effective and flexible command and control system is created by a Corps Senior Motor Transport Officer, or SMTO, which I talked about in a previous presentation that I gave. What about tanks? I try to ignore tanks as best as I can. From a logistical perspective, tanks are a nightmare. They promise so much for the future, but the Mark IV and the Mark V are a nightmare. They are far too big and heavy for standard flat railway wagons, for example. They don't fit on a standard railway wagon. So they have to build these special flat wagons called wreck tanks at great cost when we needed every single railway wagon and flat that we had. It requires special routing of trains. A tank weighs a lot, 37 tons. You've got to be able to get these things through tunnels, not all of which are across bridges, not all of which can cope. Destroyed roads means moving from railhead to assembly point. And so you've got to do that. They destroy the roads even more. They require complex fueling arrangements and a heavy outlay in special workshops and the colossal parts supply headache as well. So tanks are a bit of a pain in the backside. In a way, the fact that they were unreliable and broke down quite quickly after any given mass tank attack of the type we see in 1918 is a bit of a silver lining in an otherwise grey cloud, because that means that they don't have to be moved, they can be left behind, and they can be picked up at leisure, as it were, while the infantry and the artillery move forward. So maintaining this momentum. Well, very well, we've got the momentum, we've got the mobility. How long can it last? Well, in 1918, during the spring offensives, they began with the march with a powerful assault on the Somme. Catastrophic consequences of severing British lateral rail lines west of Amiens is negated by the rapid and effective deployment of motor transport units. Effectively, we have one north-south railway line left to provide for everything. However, the new MT units, mechanical transport units, they take the strain. It's interesting to note that the subsequent German assaults diminish in power throughout Operation Michael and also subsequent operations. Why? Logistics. One of the problems they've got is they're going over the old battlefields of the Somme, which were churned up in 1916, which were then destroyed in 1917 by the German withdrawal, and then the Germans, which took them in 1918, have to now traverse these wastelands and deserts. So one of the consequences of the events of this is the end of positional warfare, which beckons this return to open or mobile warfare. It's interesting to note the BEF uses the May to July period to construct new lines and railheads in depth with an eye to an assault, not necessarily on the 8th of August, but an attack at Somme, at Amiens, one of the major rail nodes, which would initiate the 100 Days Offensive. It's interesting to note that the Geddes system is now unsuitable for these changed conditions. Light railways were rapidly overrun by the Germans, and they're far too slow to construct and inflexible for mobile war. So what we see now is that the Director General Transportation and Transportation GHQ ceases to exist, and we revert back to the old system where it comes under the Quartermaster General. The BEF logistical quiet revolution, which had been initiated by the 1917 Somme experience, gave them an outstanding mobile supply system with which to support these attacks. But even as usable railheads receded, empty motor transport bridged the increasing gap and maintained operational momentum. So the railheads, usable railheads, are falling further behind, but that motor transport that gave them an extra 30 odd miles, technically in theory, of a radius of operations maintains the momentum. To a point. September, October 1918, we see the Hindenburg line finally taken. And that's when we see the limits of the BEF's flexible motor transport supply system. The 2nd Australian Division faced a shortage of underpants, gun parks, tunics, breeches, mule shoes. They have worn small arms ammunition wagons, and they cannot get hold of motor transport springs for love nor money. They're going over in different roads. The motor transport is taking a hell of a punishment. It's not getting maintained, and so they start breaking down. Advanced troops, and I quote, repeatedly ran out of small arms ammunition for machine guns, rifles, and revolvers. The 1st Battalion of Canadian Railway Troops, their bridging was falling further behind, and rail congestion was increasing. At Marcon Yard, we have 9 trades standing there, ready to unload, but they can't unload. And we got a 40% increase, for example, in the Canadian motor transport columns and in their mileage, and an similar increase in breakdowns. By the time we are reaching, the November of 1918, motor transport is far further forward than the 30 miles it was supposed to increase. It's now 50 to 60 miles ahead of the Somme railheads. The roads are crumbling, the vehicles are crumbling, and winter is on the way. Attrition leads to attenuation, leads to deterioration. Advanced troops founder on the Somme and on the Sambas and logistic founders on the Somme. So once again, we see another attack, which is in effect grinding to a halt on the Somme. Mercifully, Germans collapse before we can effect the halt. The sum of the parts, which I thought was witty, but it's actually not. Haig's holistic approach demonstrates a deeper understanding of the war and its lessons. Jan Smuts wrote a book in 1926, Holism and Evolution, which is where the phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, come from. The Somme battlefield plays many and varied roles, as I hope we've understood tonight, and it's central to Haig's concept of one great and continuous engagement view. And we see the sheer variety of operational conditions that applied to the Somme in 1916, 1918 through the lens of logistics and engineering. Somme is central to this development of BEF logistics, diverse, interrelated, and complex relationship that developed over time. It created these contradictory dual learning curves that define the nature and development of operational methods during the static period of 17 and the mobility of 1918. And it was also the foundation of 1918 victory. A catastrophic BEF logistical collapse was only averted by the armistice and by those lorries which have managed to squeak out to 60 miles in advance of their railhead. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes my talk for this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll now hand over to our good friend David Tattersfield. Thank you very much.
Hi, Rob. Thanks very much indeed for that superb presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed that, as I'm sure that...
Has anybody left? Have they all buggered off because they're bored?
No, there's still plenty here, don't worry. If we can just raise our hands electronically using the button on Zoom as a silent round of applause, I can confirm, Rob, that there's literally hundreds of hands being raised as a thank you there. So thanks
Thank you
for
very
that.
much.
Okay, right, it's Q&A time, folks. So let's just have a quick look. We've got quite a lot of questions already in. They were coming in thick and fast, actually, during the talk itself. So let's just have a quick look at some of these. I'll ask Bill Twist's question here. Bill says, thank you for an exuberant and terrific pitch. My question, stepping back from the port areas as systems develop, I understand the home UK rail supply was magnificent in getting stuff to the ports for loading. Did the shipping of stuff over the channel work as well? Viz, namely, was there a sufficiently developed and motivated system in Dover and Folkestone to forward the goods to France? So that's Bill's question.
Did I hear correctly? The second name Twist?
Yeah.
In which case he has a rather illustrious logistical forebear, Brigadier General, I think it's J.H. Twist, I'm not quite sure about that. Twist, he was Director of Railways in 1914 and 1915, so an important part of that. Yes, I mean, it's interesting to note that in early 1917, Geddes didn't just take over the railways in France for the BEF. He took over all the railways in the UK and became Director of Movements and Railways in the United Kingdom. So you had one great, huge system. The ports themselves, they did fantastically well. Remember, Britain were the shipping experts. You know, we also opened up the Richborough port as well. And if we're looking at cross-channel, the main issue there wasn't necessarily shipping, though. You know, there's always a shipping crisis going on, irrespective of whether the Germans are engaged in restricted U-boat warfare or not, simply because the pressure of tonnage and the increasing amount of tonnage is always going to, mean there isn't enough. But it was supremely well organized. The ports were supremely well organized. One of the breaks was the provision of escorts by the Royal Navy, because they were overstretched themselves. They had to do a blockade itself, a logistical form of warfare. But yeah, certainly by 1917, 1918, the smoothness of it is really quite incredible. You know, their biggest problem is making sure that they can deal with bottlenecks. Actual bulk movement, that's no problem whatsoever. It's flooding through, it's pouring through. It's keeping pace with this largesse of supply which is coming across the channel. Interestingly enough, in 1918, we see the British introduce the Ro-Ro, the roll-on, roll-off ferry. It's exactly the type that you'll see, when you go to Dover today, where you could literally just pull a train on, a convoy of motor lorries on, and it would just simply pour off at the other end straight onto the system there. So the answer is yes, it was a fully integrated system. The only time it really begins to suffer is in this forward zone after the railhead, beyond the writ of the DGT, as it were. And that's really due to the vicissitudes of war. Hope that answers the question.
Thanks. Yes, I'm sure Bill, if he was able to say anything, would probably thank you for that. Right. Okay. Stephen Rees. Stephen, do you want to just unmute yourself there?
Hello, Stephen.
Yep. Rob, fascinating talk. This will sound a really stupid question, because this
No such thing as a stupid question.
This is hopefully a dissertation topic of mine on an MA. But what comes first in the 100 Days Offensive? Do the generals decide we're going to have an offensive? What can you logistics supply to us? Or logistics say we'll have X, Y, and Z ready if you want to do an offensive. Sorry to sound so simplistic.
Well, yeah, it's a really important question. Which comes first, the logistics or the action?
Yeah.
The answer to that is that the action is defined by the logistics. The creation of the new rail lines and roads behind this new front, and the proximity of Amiens, to the point of attack, plus the fact that Germans are tremendously weak there. We tend to forget that, in the great push through the 8th of August. But it's the logistics that begin to define operations. It's noticeable, for example, the move of the Canadian Corps is an administrative triumph. They moved in secret. An entire Canadian Corps, which is much bigger than a British Corps, way bigger. It's effectively a compact army, moved secretly in silence. That is logistics. It's interesting to note that Foch's idea of the concentric assault all focus on severing the German railway lines. It's now logistics which dominates strategic and operational thinking. So in that one, which comes first, it's the logistical egg rather than the operational chicken.
Okay.
I
Thank
think
you
I'll
very
use
much
that.
indeed.
No, I think I'll keep that. Yeah, trademark it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for that. Gordon Bell. Gordon, just want to mute yourself?
Good evening. My thoughts was the same attention to detail given to the removal of the wounded from the casualty clearing stations via motor ambulance and ambulance trains.
Absolutely, it was. I mean, if I'd have, I was anticipating this question. If I'd looked at casualty evacuation, CASEVAC, the system, that is an entire talk all by itself, because they have specific, very, very specific requirements, yeah. And effectively, even though the Army Service Corps it's got wheels on it, yeah, or it craps out of its backside, it's not human, the Army Service Corps run it, yeah. But the motor transport for the motor ambulance convoys, the MACs, yeah, and also the things like, omnibuses for the walking wounded. At Messines, for example, they had a regular bus service, with bus stops where they picked up walking wounded and transferred them. Yeah, the casualty evacuation system was a marvel. It developed throughout 1916. It kind of reached its peak in early 1917 and continued to be so, because there was always this notion that you must clear the wounded, get them out as fast as is humanly possible. So in there, logistics always dominated, whether that be by ambulance, train, horse-drawn ambulance, motor ambulance convoys. Yeah, the whole thing was fully integrated, and it's astonishing how quickly they could move wounded men out. At Passchendaele, for example, there's an argument to be made to say they could move the wounded out quicker than they could get them, the walking soldiers themselves, back into the rear areas. I hope
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Robin Broadhurst. Robin, you just want to mute yourself there?
Rob, a very good evening. That's a marvellous talk. Thank you so much. Two quick questions. One very simple one. I hope that you're going to write the definitive book on logistics in the First War, because it needs to be written, and you're obviously the man to write it. So please get your pen out and start writing.
It's partially written already. I had a deal with a particular publishing house back in 2018, and I started becoming ill after that, and I developed multiple myeloma. So cancer, which has just driven a coach and horses straight through all plans and everything. I'm coming out the other side. Next year is going to be, I'm going to take what I've got and expand it and actually get the damn thing published.
Well, that's great news. And my specific question is, what was the role of Woolley Robertson in all of this? Woolley had been Quartermaster General, after all, in 1915. He goes back to Whitehall. How is he involved in this?
That's a really interesting question. It's not something I really looked at. I tend to avoid looking at the senior command in favour of looking at a mechanistic approach. How did things actually function? But Woolley Robinson was a man who was pragmatic. If nothing else, he was pragmatic. His handling of what was, close to a logistical collapse in 1914 was masterful. And indeed, his early part of 1915, when he's dealing with, the expansion is building up very rapidly. It's quite small compared to what we see 1916, but he really is, yeah. I think that he had a very, very important influence on what was happening in the war cabinet, and also I think with Haig. Now I'm supposing here, but I've looked at a little bit of correspondence between them, yeah, and it's clear that Robertson understands the role of logistics. Haig doesn't at first, but he begins to pick it up really rather quickly and becomes an extremely good manager of the BEF as a corporation, steering well clear of his strategic and operational abilities here, just in favour of that. So I suspect very strongly, just on what little evidence I've seen, that he acts as one of these quiet influences. Yeah, he certainly, I've seen, he certainly manages to step back. And one of the reasons he's such a powerful Westerner is because he realizes very clearly that you can supply the Western Front. Whereas if you're going to zoom off to Mesopotamia or Palestine, at one point he turns around, I do know, and he actually castigates Lloyd George, saying, if you send tanks to Palestine, yeah, you will have no tanks and no shipping for the Western Front. Neither will you have any new guns, and neither will you be able to actually repair the old guns as well, nor will you have any spare parts. Oh, and your shipping will just simply disappear. You know, and he manages to put the lid on, Lloyd George's somewhat, Eastern approach, yeah, because of this logistics. Now, effectively shipping something 2,000 miles as opposed to 30 miles, or 50 miles or 70 miles, yeah, it's a no-brainer. And that, I think, is where he has a significant influence on the cabinet itself.
Thank you, Rob. That's great.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks for that. Thanks, Rob, for your answer there. Ian Ference, do you want to just unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was a fantastic and very informative talk.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you.
So I'm curious about the failing of light rail at the Somme, because I know it was effective for the French earlier on in the war. Do you think, first of all, that the failing was due to its adoption too late, and that it could have played a better role had it been adopted prior to 1st July? And secondly, do you think the failing was a result primarily of its late adoption or of the unsuitability of light rail in general in the particular battlefield of the Somme?
Right. Number one, you just nailed it. They adopted too late. Effectively, the war overtook them. Had they adopted in 1915, late, even as January 16, yeah, and they followed the French, they were aware of the importance of it, they were aware of what it could achieve, but they simply came to it too late, too piecemeal. And by the time they organized it into the light railway, it got its own directorate at GHQ Transportation, yeah, it was simply too late, yeah, so it was never going to keep pace. Secondly, what light rail promised and what it could actually deliver were two very, very different things. It was meant to be quicker to lay down light rail than it was to build road. Well, it is for light rail, for something like 12 pound or 16 pound light rail, which doesn't require any ballasting, which you can chuck a 20 horsepower simplex on, but they have very limited carrying capacity. You also have light rail in terms of Baldwin locomotives. Now, these require 24 pound rail. They require ballasting. They're a miniature railway, as it were, yeah? And they could never keep pace with these forward rails. The other thing is, it's one thing to build a light railway system. It's another thing entirely to run it. And they could not get over, because light rail was probably the only transportation system which spanned the divide between direct to general transportation and the zone of the armies. It's the armies that ran it, the corps that used it, they were effectively the customer, but it was controlled by GHQ Transportation, who obviously needed to have the strategic overview, and they could never get beyond that. Next point is that the very statistical excellence of a chap called George B. Harrell, who is instituted by Geddes, he missed and misunderstood about the nature of light rail. Perfect example was this conference that I mentioned in August of 1917. They said X thousand tons were being supplied by light rail, but what they weren't looking at is how much of that tonnage actually arrived at the proper destination at the proper time. And what would happen, of course, is that a light railway would go out with, say, 10 tons of material on board, 20 tons, or pick whatever number you like. It would arrive late because they were absolute swine to run on time. The working party that was meant to unload it, the gun or wherever else, cleared off, so it would go back. As far as the statisticians were concerned, that's another 10 tons. And then it would go back out again, and that's another 10 tons. The amount of tonnage they were actually moving, which was useful and there on time, was actually something like somewhere between 35 to 45% overstated. Secondly, it was meant to be quicker to lay than roads, and certainly it is if you're laying down a proper road. As with everything else, road building techniques became better and better and better, quicker and quicker and quicker. When you slap down a beach slab road, which is what you need in the immediate aftermath of an assault, yeah, you'll find it's much easier to lay down than that. Light railways never actually worked properly. They were an important adjunct because they stopped the motor transport system collapsing completely and utterly. Yeah, so they're important in that, but they never ever achieved what they meant to do. And when it came to mobility, once things began to loosen up in 18, and also we see it in German withdrawals at Hindenburg Line 17, they simply lack the flexibility. Quite often as well, the light railway would run to a certain point, and then you'd need motor transport to offload it onto to actually get it to, say, the gun positions as well. So it became a trans-shipping problem. The final problem as well is wagons, because just as it was for the standard gauge, a broad gauge, so it was for the 60 centimeters, because the Director General of Transportation, Geddes, insisted that no wagon should ever cross from the army control, yeah, into the world of division. Now, divisions, they operated 60 centimeter lines as well, though these were, muscle powered, either mule or pack pony or Shanks pony and so. And of course, you can't keep on transshipping, so they used to just take the wagon. Of course, once the wagon disappears into that world, they can't keep track of it. They have a fantastic system of keeping track of it as far as a core, but beyond that, it just disappears and it never comes back. Usually, you can pretty much suspect that whatever wood's there is now gone and is warming Tommy. Yeah, so the whole administrative system of it begins to break down. The Canadians, who had run effectively their own version of light railway since early 1917, on the Arras front, they made it all work. They were tremendously efficient. They saw it as one continuum whereby you lay down your line and you lay it down, your initial light line in order for it to be upgraded later. So they saw it as a complete system. They'd already been using a lot of light railway in construction with the Canadian Pacific Railroad in Canada. They were the kings of light railway, and their system worked. Geddes wanted to change it. To the credit of First Army Commander General Horn, he just said, no, it works, and we're leaving it like that. I mean, one of the crucial issues as well is you need officers who understand light railways and understand the needs of corps. So, for example, there was meant to be this critical person known as the CRLO, the CLRO, the Corps Light Railway Officer. Yeah, he is the essential junction between the user, which is corps in effect, and army and above. The first ones are not appointed till September 1917. Before that, each corps has its own concept of what a light railway is, what it's used for. And of course, you end up with just this, horrible mishmash of administrative, nightmare. So that, for example, at Messines, the headline figures for light railways, it's marvelous. Dig deeper beyond the main report, you began to see actually it's useless. Well, it's not useless, but 9 Corps expected to carry it's like 90% of its ammunition by light railway. They end up carrying 48% of it. Same in 2 Anzac Corps. In 1 Anzac Corps. Same also in 10 Corps. Because and none of them could work with each other either. So it was a bit of a spaghetti mess. At the end of the day.
Awesome, thank you. Can't wait to read the book when it comes out.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for your question there. Gordon, you're asking a question on behalf of yourself and several others, for example, Richard Crowe. Thanks for everybody who's asked a similar question, but Gordon's just been everybody to both with a particular question.
Very patient now, people. Very patient.
Go, Gordon.
Oh, very interesting. Absolutely smashing that. Informative and a fascinating insight into how to wage a war. Now, you've covered very comprehensively what we did. My question is, how did the Germans' management of logistics compare with ours?
I've spent 25 years just trying to understand ours. I began by looking at artillery and operational systems and tactics and all the rest of it. Yeah, had that nailed down in 3 or 4 years, no problem. Yeah, give you chapter and verse on that. Trying to understand the logistical system behind it because it knows no boundaries. Yeah, you go just go, oh, division and that's it, or brigade and that's that. No, it spreads its tentacles, it goes further and further back. You end up reading about, in order to understand how a shell arrives at a gun in France, you end up looking at river transport in Mesopotamia. It is utterly interconnected. So I simply haven't had time to have a look at the French system, except cursorily, or the German system. The German system was beset by a major problem, and that is German commanders don't do logistics. They do tactics. They don't really do operations because that requires an understanding of logistics and engineering. And it's no surprise that every time they were on the advance, they were buggered up by their own logistics. We can see it in 1918. You can see it, on the Eastern Front. They constantly screw up. You can see it in World War II. We look at Rommel. It's all very well charging across the desert, yeah? If you've got no fuel bowsers at the back of you, your tanks are going to stop. Montgomery, plodding along, yeah, he understood that for every gun, you need shells. For every tank, you need fuel. Yeah, and that's why it continued. I mean, Eisenhower said it in late 44. It's simple. We understood logistics. The Germans did not. Yeah, so it was the same in the First World War. They had an effective logistical system, but it was starved of resources. I mean, if you look, there's a really good quote by I can't remember now. He's a Scottish soldier who was captured on the 22nd or 23rd of March, and he was taken back through German lines. Now, classic psychology says the further away you get from your own troops, the more depressed you get. He's getting the opposite, and the reason is, he says, he looked at I'm paraphrasing here. We were looking at their transport, and if they thought they're going to win the war with young conglomeration, they were thinking what was not for them. And that sums up the Germans. Their logisticians were excellent. I mean, it's a profound irony that the head of the German army is a quartermaster general, because he ain't no quartermaster general like I understand it to be. Yeah, but they had excellent logisticians who understood, but they were just simply swamped out by this martial obsession with war and lack of resources. The preparation for 21st of March 18, tons of shells. In fact, they're beginning to send back, do not send us any more ammunition. Yeah. The lorries are running on rims. They've got two horses, a donkey, and a zebra pulling this cart that they've managed to drag out of a farm somewhere. They have no real logistical support there, as it were, irrespective of the quality of their logistical commanders. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, it's the longest I don't know I've ever had.
That's a good point, Gordon.
Fascinating. Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much.
I was going to say exactly the same, Gordon. To say that you said, "Oh, I don't know the answer to this, Rob." That was a splendid answer. Sarah, do you want to open your mic there?
Well, mine really follows on from that, because I was going to ask you now. Do you think that the very early on in your talk you mentioned that the supply chain seemed so well developed? I think that is because, as a result of 1066 and all that, our only battles and wars have always been on continent, whatever. Or do you think that, how do we compare to the likes of the French and to the development of the supply chain?
The French in the First World War had a superb supply chain. There's no two ways about it. They were better than we were. They understood the importance. I mean, I mentioned Verdun. I could have talked about the voies sacrées and the integration there of motor transport and railways. They were very, very, very good indeed when it came to logistics. simply because pre-war they'd had experience of running huge armies and supplying those armies. It's really is quite simple as that. And they were also kind of really quite advanced in their use of motor transport as well. When we move to the pre-industrial revolution era, we see that the Brits really understood logistics and the rest didn't. We see, for example, no British commander, Wellington or otherwise, would have ever have thought about, let's go and attack Moscow in the winter. That's a great idea. We simply would never have thought that. Interestingly enough, if you read about the preparations for the Battle of Agincourt, we have our wagons, our oxen, horses already. And interestingly enough, we do things like, for example, we had an excellent trade with port with Portugal. But instead of actually, paying us in gold, we asked them to pay us in finished staves for arrows and also for bows, because their yew was the very best, as it were. It's not the English oak that wins the war. So we do have a really good concept of that. When it comes to the industrial age, though, that's Britain inevitably we're going to be good at logistics, even if we don't know it, because we're just simply advanced. We have the biggest railway system in the world. Where our railway engineers and experts would scatter throughout South America, throughout Africa, so on and so forth. Yeah, French, absolutely excellent system. Superb system. We learned an awful lot from them, especially about convoys and the problem of parking up lorries. Because if you park up 90 or 100 lorries, you've just made a very big target. But if you scatter them everywhere, by the time you gather them all together, they've already done about 200 miles before they even begin to pick up their first list. So the answer to that is kind of broadly, we were always good at logistics pre-industrial. During industrialization, we began to go a lot better, but so did the French as well. In fact, I'd argue they were better organized than we are. They had a better system. The Germans, they just don't get it. They really don't get logistics at all. I hope that kind of answers your question. Yeah.
No, thank you.
My expertise is in logistics of the First World War, not world logistics from zero AD, as it were.
No, thank you. Fabulous talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for your answer, Rob. Before we go to the last question, which will be Robert, I'm just going to slip in another question here. That's coming. There's lots of other questions which we just simply don't have time for. But one interesting question here that's caught my eye is from Kit Reed, who I don't think Kit has got a microphone. So this is Kit's question. Are there any BEF railway lines from the First World War still existing or in use? And asks about maps as well, if there's any maps of these. So do you know the answer?
Yes. Yes and yes is the answer to that. It's interesting. You can, most of them, a good deal of them were taken up, and then throughout the course of the 20th century, as motor transport began to dominate, even though France kept a large railway system, it contracted just as the British one did. Ironically enough, the Geddes Axe in 1922. Yeah. The answer is, but yes. Amiens was always a major rail centre, but it took a quantum leap forward after the British really developed it. We see, for example, if you look at, I was looking at Albert the other day. Albert is a very small place. And you've got the line that comes up from Dernancourt today, and if you go to Albert, you see it's got quite a big marshalling yard there, and that's a particular consequence of the First World War. Also, interestingly enough, there are specific railway maps, detailing light railways, full scale, standard gauge railways, etc., etc. You can compare those to Google Earth, and you can still see loads of areas in France where fields are an odd shape, or there's this sudden huge gap in the middle of a wood, something like that, something like about 300-meter wide gap, and it's about 2 kilometers long, and that's where they used to have marshalling yards there, so on and so forth. So yes, the imprint of the BEF's railways is still there in northern France, and also in if you look in Belgium as well.
Thanks for that. I'm sure that's answered Kate's question there. We've still got stacks of questions, but it's now 20 to 10, so I'm not going to.
I think my voice is starting to go as well.
Yeah. So Robert's been waiting very patiently. I've deliberately held Robert on to the last question because it's quite an in-depth and interesting question. So Robert, unmute yourself and fire away.
Okay, well, thanks, Rob,
Hi.
very much for that. Very, very interesting. Hiya. And my question was to do with, in your sort of diagram of the chain of command, or chain of supply, sorry, the at what junction, at what point would supplies that were purchased or obtained in France or Belgium actually join it? I mean,
Okay.
was that an easy juncture done by similar sort of people, or was it more difficult than that?
If I was to give you an actual supply chain, it would be like 100,000 spiders crawling across pages. Yeah, it's incredibly complex because you have GHQ, which is purchasing in the French, things like bulk coal, operation of quarries, bulk purchases of things like, all the windscreens for any of the motor transport, all came from France, all triple X class, tire presses, vegetables, so on and so forth. Below that, above that, you have agreements between the Board of Trade in Britain and also in France as well about supplies. You have an incredibly complex accounting system whereby, because we paid for everything that we used, simple as that. There was a lot of arguments over I think the French import duty known as the octroi, which was eventually sort of disappeared. But the fact is, I've got a 100-page file on that. I never read beyond page 3, to be honest with you. But then below that, you've got each army has its own particular specializations and needs as well. So it's engaging with the economy there, local French economy. Again, for example, in terms of roadstone in the Somme area, because it's chalk, and chalk is an absolute nightmare to work with, you have an investigation system because, for example, below that, you've got corps, battalions, brigades, battalions. There's a scam going on with tires, where we're using used tires. And there's this particular gentleman I think he was Belgian, who was buying up every tire he could. And then they began to investigate this, and they found out he was shipping it via Modane down to Italy, where it was then moved over to Germany, and it was Germany reusing the tires. So you had to watch out for that. So there is this huge economy going on, which links the French and the British as well, and which works above the international level as well. Britain's supplying shipping, it's supplying a lot of France hasn't really got that much in the way of shipping. It's supplying a lot of raw materials for France. France is supplying coal. It's been supplemented in Britain because we have better quality coal, and so on and so forth. That in and of itself is a vast subject as well. I mean, even when it comes to shipping, we had specialized agents working with the French, working in Switzerland with the neutral countries to try and make sure the Germans didn't get there. So it is. Effectively, the actual fighting bit of the war is the minor part. And then you've got this global system, which all the belligerents are engaged with, especially Britain and France, and then latterly the United States of America. Yeah. So the answer is yes, there is a huge economy. I worked out once that the biggest employer in northern France was the BEF when it came to the employment of local people. Yeah, I mean, like I've got reams of stuff on different types of of forestry and the Jura Mountains and so on and so forth, and how much to pay for that, and whether we're going to pay back in wood, whether we're going to pay back in kind, whether we're going to pay back in gold. So yeah, there's a huge economy there.
Thank you very much.
It's a very, very basic level. Battalions used to try and get round, used to work with the Flemish people who, they're sharp. If you've ever read the Spanish Farm trilogy, yeah, you get a real good insight into, just how sharp the Flemish are. And what they were doing, they were selling potatoes to British battalions and companies way below the actual proper price, yeah. But then they were claiming back from the British government saying these potatoes have been destroyed by these battalions that have been over our fields, yeah, and therefore making a bit of a butty on top of that.
Okay, right. Thanks for that very full answer, Rob. There are other questions, but I'm gonna have to stop it there. So apologies to everybody who's asked a question and who's typed a question, but we've not had a chance to answer it. Rob, that was an absolutely splendid, superb presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thoroughly enjoyed that.
Once again, you're proud.
Once again, if we could just raise our hands collectively as a round of applause, and I can confirm that there's hundreds of hands going up again, so that's splendid to see. Rob, I've thoroughly enjoyed that, and I know everybody else has as well. What can I say? I just hope that we can get you back for another presentation. Let's we'll put our heads together in a few weeks' time to see what else you've possibly got in your locker for us, because I do know that people like and really enjoy listening to what you have to say.
Thank you very much.
We have another webinar next week, which is going to be about the riding through the ruins, the hardest bicycle race ever held, which was through the devastated red zone of Flanders and northern France. So that's next Monday at 8 p.m. So if you've not registered for that, please do log on to the WFA website, click through onto the registration and get yourselves registered for that. That's all from us tonight. So I do hope that you managed to watch the last bit of the football. Rob, I won't spoil it by telling you what the current score is. And for everybody else, thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll see you in future webinars.
Thank you very much indeed. Bye bye, everybody.
Bye bye. Thanks a lot.
Mademoiselle.